Hey, just a quick note to let you know that this video is a pre-recorded live event. If you'd like to join our upcoming events, such as demos and office hours, you can check out our schedule on our support page. Hope you find this video helpful and look forward to seeing you in our next event. Well, thanks everyone for joining. My name is Jason Wark. I'm an animal welfare scientist at Lincoln Park Zoo. And today I'm going to be going through a live demo of PivotCharts in Microsoft Excel and how you can use those with your ZooMonitor data. And so if you haven't had a chance to watch the demo I did last month on pivot tables, I would certainly recommend starting there and checking that out first. Because basically our pivot chart is essentially just a chart that's tied to the dynamic data in a pivot table. So as you'll see as I go through with the demo, you'll certainly need to be able to master, being able to build a pivot table and really understanding the principles of a pivot table to really unlock and be able to use pivot charts. And so last in the demo I did for pivot tables, in that example, we walked through some data for our pygmy hippos, and we were looking specifically at one of the interval channels we had on that project for substrate. And so for our pygmy hippos, we were recording whether they're on land, whether they're partially submerged in the water or fully submerged. And that's really what we did with the pivot tables there. We made a few pivot tables. We made one calculating the percent of time or percent of intervals per session. And then we made a second pivot table averaging that. So we could look at it by time of day. And so that was really the question we were at with that demo, was looking at for AM and PM for our two pygmy hippos, Annie and Pogo, how much time were they spending in these different substrate categories. And so today I'm going to sort of lead off with that and kind of take that a step farther. In that demo I'm mentioning there, we didn't actually get to graphing. So I built out all of the pivot tables and copied the data, but we didn't graph it there. And so today what I'm going to do is kind of take a step further and then graph the data from the pivot table so we can so you can see that. I will say, there are two different approaches basically that I'm presenting here. So there's the approach of the pivot tables, building the pivot tables, copying and pasting your data out, and then you can individually graph that data from that, separate, that data that's not living in a pivot table, right? And if you have already recorded all of your data and your data collection is done, I would certainly recommend that approach because you have a lot more flexibility in terms of your chart types. You have a lot more formatting options, and generally you can, see your data and see the calculations a lot easier going that approach. I think the true value of pivot charts is really when you have situations where you have ongoing data. So you have a project you're recording data from or for, and you are constantly adding new data to it, and you want to be able to update graphs. In that first approach where you're building pivot tables and then copying and pasting data out, to do that, obviously you would have to first, refresh your first pivot table, copy and paste your data out, refresh your second pivot table, copy and paste your data out, and then refresh your graphs, right? So there's a lot of steps that get added in there when you do it that approach for dynamic data. So it's really not ideal if you're having to redo this, on any sort of regular, monthly kind of cadence or anything like that. With pivot charts, you sort of shortcut a lot of that approach. So you're going directly from, your data straight to your data in the pivot table, straight to the graph. And so you're not having those intermediate steps where we copied and pasted the data out. And so you can easily just add data, as you'll see, add data directly to your original data set and then hit refresh, and then all of your new data is there. So really great in those situations with, ongoing data collection. And so I think, as you'll see, I'll try to walk through this demo. I'm going to start and just show a few examples of what the pivot charts look like, and then we'll work up to building those, and I'll show some different cool add-on features that you can do in Excel, things that you can add to your pivot charts. All right, so let me go ahead and pull over our Excel file here. All right. Okay, so we have here our pivot chart and our pivot table. So everything over here should look somewhat familiar. So this is exactly kind of where we left off in that previous demo I did, building out pivot table. So we have, like I said, Annie and Pogo, and we have our 2 time periods, AM and PM, and now we have our percents here. And so this here is what the pivot chart looks like. And I formatted it here and I made it a little bit fancier. And we'll kind of go through some of those steps and how I formatted this here. But you can see basically this data is directly linked to these cells in this pivot table. And the important thing here to understand is that if you were to add, let's say maybe a new individual joined your group, this pivot table is going to have extra rows, right? So it's gonna get larger there. And that's really where the pivot chart is really powerful, is because it's going to accommodate that. If you had tried to just graph these cells directly, and obviously you added new cells with data below it, that graph wouldn't update there. And so that's really what I mean when I say it's dynamically linked to this pivot table. Anything that changes in this pivot table will be reflected directly here in your pivot chart. And a few other things that I'll go through is you see I have a few slicers that I added on here. I also added a timeline here, just showing some other fancy options for how you can set up your data in Excel, and just some different ways you can quickly slice and dice and get to your questions there. So this is example 1. I was going to show another quick example here, something similar. So this is another pivot chart here. So this chart here is directly linked to this pivot table here. And you can see kind of a different example here. So in that previous one, we were looking at kind of the total averages or the totals for the different height categories, submerged, partially submerged, and land, for the 2 time periods for Annie and Pogo. In this one here, we're still looking at the same topic or the same category here. We're looking at that substrate category, and we're looking at it and Annie and Pogo, but really this one we wanted to kind of know more longitudinally, are we seeing trends increasing or decreasing? Are we seeing any spikes there? And so in this one, I represented it a little bit differently. I have each day represented here on the x-axis, and then you can see using this stacked column chart here, you can see kind of the changes over time across days here. And then, of course, up here with the slicer, you can do cool stuff like if you want to just look at December, you can just click December. If you want to expand that to multiple months, you can just click and drag that slicer over. So a lot of, obviously, a lot of power here to be able to quickly visualize your data for new date ranges, new time periods, stuff like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and start building one of these pivot charts. So we're going to start by selecting our data here. So clicking up in the top left, going up to insert. And so before we went to pivot table over here. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to go to pivot chart. And we are going to add this pivot chart to a new sheet. And so when I did that, I should have mentioned there's a few different options there. You can add a pivot chart or pivot chart with pivot table. I'll be honest, I don't honestly know what the difference is there. I tried both, and both will add the pivot table because the pivot table is the underlying connection for the pivot chart. So I've just been adding the pivot chart, and it will automatically, as you see, add the pivot table here as well. So now we have our pivot table, and we can go ahead and build out our pivot table here. So let's recreate this first one here. So this one here, we were looking at kind of more averages for Annie and Pogo by substrate. And so to do that, we have, so let me drag down our interval channel 2 value. And so that was our substrate category for this project. So that was our second interval channel in the project. So we can drag that down here. I'm going to drag down column so you can see we have our 3 categories there. And for this one data point right now. And now let's drag down focal name. so we can look at it for Annie and Pogo. And specifically what we were after is this observation time category of looking at this AM and PM. And you can see pretty much right now, we've already got a good start on recreating that pivot chart right there. And so one of the differences between what you see here and obviously the other one is this is a column chart, not that stacked column chart. This is a clustered column chart here. And so honestly, I think, one of the ways I like to use personally pivot charts is to have more of that clustered, that stacked column chart and really let you look at over time. Because one of the challenges here, honestly, with using this approach of using your pivot charts is the limitations that you can't really calculate standard error and some of the variability metrics you could easily if you were doing that multi-step, create your pivot table, copy and paste your data, create your pivot table, paste your data. You can have those error bars and that variability. You can calculate that in those steps. Here it's a little bit more challenging. And so generally what I just do is just looking at the relative difference between these categories. And so we can change this from this clustered column up here if we go up to design and then go to change chart type. And so you'll see that there's lots of different options that it gives you to use for your pivot chart. However, if you've ever tried to make a pivot chart, you'll see that not a lot of these actually, it will let you graph data in a pivot table. So you can't make a pivot chart with it. So for instance, if let's say I wanted to go with a box plot, this box and whisker plot, it's going to tell me no, that you can't do that. And I actually have a quick thing I can show you here. So this is basically the list you just saw, and these are the ones that you are not able to use as a pivot chart because it can't chart the data in that pivot table there. So you can see, one of the biggest ones there is you can't obviously chart this XY scatter data. You can do a line graph, but not scatter point data. Obviously not for maps, no stock graphs, tree maps, sunburst, histograms, box and whisker, box plots, waterfall, and funnel. So you can see that there's definitely a number of charts that you are limited when you do use a pivot chart. Any of these other ones that I don't have that little red triangle next to, you certainly can use as normal as, if you were graphing. Okay, so what we're going to do, we were going to add this as a stacked column chart. And so there's a few different stacked column charts here. There's the regular stacked column and then the 100% stacked column. So I'm going to choose the 100% stacked column here. And the reason for that is for each time period, I want to know, what's the relative, ratio of each of these categories for the different, for AM for Annie, for PM for Annie, to be able to kind of compare easily there. You'll see we're having another category here that it adds in for blank. And so this is for blank names. So there must have been a row, where there was a blank name in there. And so you can easily filter that out with down here. And so there's lots of different ways you can filter your data in the pivot chart. And they add these drop downs right here. So you can see, since we had focal name as one of the options, you can go and you can unselect the blank there. And now we have basically just the two of them. And yeah, and so right there, we pretty much, and you can see, how quick that was. We already have our pivot chart looking at AM and PM for Annie and Pogo with literally just a few clicks. We didn't have to create the pivot table, copy and paste data out in that approach. The difference is though, and this is a really kind of important one to consider, what you're seeing here, these percentages. So if I hover over this here, it's not showing percentage. So right now it's showing you the count, the number of intervals that was partially submerged for Annie in AM. So that's what that 175 is referring to there. And so we can convert this to a percent. So obviously it's graphing it as a percent, but it's not showing you as a percent. And to do that, you can easily click over here. So it's a right click and you go to show value as, and then percent of row total. And when you do that, now when I hover over, you'll see it's showing it as 86%, this one here, 9.3%, and so forth. If you had gone through and did that demo I showed with the pivot tables, your percentage numbers are going to be different. And the reason for that is in that previous demo, what we did is we first calculated the percent per session. And then what we did is we averaged across sessions for those different categories. And that really is the ideal approach there. You get, obviously that's where I mentioned your variability, your error bar. So you can look at how variable it was across sessions. So that's kind of important. So, if you're certainly presenting this for any sort of, if you're analyzing this for publication or any sort of, manuscript preparation, I'd certainly recommend that approach. Here, what you're seeing is slightly different. So what you're seeing here is if you took all of your intervals for this date range, basically put them all together, and then, instead of averaging or instead of calculating that percent per session, which is what we did before, now we're calculating that percent basically across everything. So in some sessions, if there may have only been 5 intervals, and other sessions 10 intervals, you're basically lumping all of those together and getting these percents. So they are going to come out slightly differently, and you're not obviously going to be able to calculate any sort of variability in your data because you are really lumping everything together. So that's just something to really keep in mind with your needs and how you're looking at the data. If you want to make sure that you're representing variability and error, and generally we use standard error, you'll certainly want to take that pivot table approach. This can be a really easy approach for a very quick look at your data to see if there are changes happening over time. But obviously it's losing that piece there, that variability. Okay, and so we have this graph here. There were a few formatting things that I did on the other graph here. So let me just show those really quick. And so you saw before I had a title up here. And so you can easily add that if you go up to that design tab and then go to add chart element. And then if we go down to chart title and then above chart. And you can also add those from over here too. So we'll call this, let me see, substrate by time of day. And so we'll also want to label our y-axis here too, so we can go ahead and add in an axis title. So I'm adding it this time through this approach. And so you can see basically doing the same thing, 2 different ways you can access this option here. And percent of intervals is what I'm going to call this. Okay. And so, you see, obviously we have all the data in here. Oh, I still have this blank here. And so we probably don't want that. So you can click this and you can remove the blanks. You see, obviously there were no blanks showing up, but it did find that in the data. And so that's why it was showing up there. You might want this not positioned on the right of your graph. So you can easily just right click it, go to format legend, and then you'll see over here you have options. So you can move it down to the bottom if you'd like. And so the big difference between this graph here, and obviously if you were to graph this, not from pivot table data, and it was not a pivot chart, is you wouldn't have these values here. You wouldn't have these drop downs to be able to filter your graph, based on the data that's already in the pivot table. And these obviously are directly linked. And so that's something that's really important to understand too, is that the pivot chart and the pivot table are bidirectionally linked. So if you filter one, you're going to have if you filter the table, the chart will get filtered. If you filter the chart, the table will get filtered. They're both directly linked to each other. So for instance, if we did want to filter out submerged here, you'll see it's also filtering it out over here as well. And then the last thing, just to clean this up a little bit, it adds the value. And so for us, the value was that interval channel 2 value column we used in our data. So that's where it said, in my ZooMonitor export, submerged, partially submerged, or land. So it was that data column there. You can right click that and go to hide value fields button on chart and clean that up. And so you can see it looks, pretty much very similar to what it would look like if you had charted this, not as a pivot chart, but just directly from your data there. Let me see. So another thing to really keep in mind here that is different, if you were doing this as a regular chart versus a pivot chart, is this select data option up here. And so you see if I click this up here, it looks very similar to if you had charted this regularly. But the big difference is you see you can't remove any series up here. And that's important because you might add in a column over here to say like count the number of sessions, right? That's something I did in that pivot table demo where I had a first column here where I counted how many sessions were in these categories, and then I had my data after that. And if you're working off of just that pivot table data, that's really great because you can see, your count, you can calculate standard deviation if you want, you can have this pivot table have lots of data. And then when you graph it, you can choose obviously which parts of your data that you want to graph when you're doing it manually. With the pivot chart, as you can see, you don't have that freedom. You don't have that luxury. So it's going to chart everything in your pivot table. And so if there was anything you wanted to, also look at here in your pivot table, it's going to start throwing it into your graph here too. So just keep that in mind, some of those limitations there. I wanted to quickly point out too what this plus and minus do down here. So you can see if you look at the pivot table over here, you can see there are a couple different things expanded. So Annie is expanded so you can see AM and PM. So when we made our pivot table, let me pull that back up. There we are. When we made our pivot table, we had focal name here and we had observation time under. And so it nested observation time underneath focal name. So that's why you see that relationship there. What this plus and minus is referring to is basically expanding and contracting, expanding and collapsing, these categories over here. So if I were to do this for just Annie, you can see basically what that bidirectional, link looks like. I collapsed it for Annie, and now Annie has one column, but Pogo still has two columns. And so if I did it for Pogo, you'll see it just did it there for Pogo as well. And so you can play around with that just to look at basically how your data looks collapsed and not collapsed. So if you wanted to look at it just Annie and Pogo ignoring time of day, that's obviously what we've got right here. And so basically the equivalent of this in the pivot table is essentially the subtotals, which if you remember in that pivot table demo, I turned off subtotals. I didn't have those in there. This is essentially your subtotals for Annie and Pogo, and you can toggle between those in your individual data here. Okay, let me see. All right, so I think the next thing I want to do really quick here before jumping into that second example is really just show how easy it is to add new data, right? So that's the real value of it. And so I have some data here. So this is going from March 18th up until a few days ago. And so I have this data, and down here you can see my data left off on March 16th. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take my new data that I just exported. I'm going to click the row, Control, Shift, and then down arrow, quickly selecting all of those rows that have data there. So Control, Shift, down is what I just did. And then Control C, and you can see it copied it there. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to paste. And so when I paste data, from the ZooMonitor export, one of the things that I will generally always do is just scroll over and just make sure that the data is still aligned. So one of the things that you'll run into with the ZooMonitor export is, if you deactivated a channel or you added a new question, you could all of a sudden have your data not lining up. And you can see our question here for which Pygmy Hippo had access on exhibit, you can see that's still aligned here. So we should be good to go. But that's definitely something to be careful about when you're copying and pasting in data, appending it to the bottom of your data sheet. Just make sure that it still lines up and it's still aligned with your previous data set. So we copied and pasted that data in, super easy to do. It's not already populating here though, it's not showing it. And so what you're gonna have to do is go up to Pivot Table, Analyze, and then you'll click Refresh. And so you saw when I clicked Refresh, it just added that data in. So I'm gonna hit Control-Z to go back before I did that and show you a little something else that is important to understand with pivot charts. So you'll see here, so you saw we have this data in here, 9.68 for Annie, Pogo. This is the same exact data that we just built here. I am going to go back and click refresh one more time. So you see it updated here and it also updated here. And so that's something that's really important to understand, is that when you do refresh one pivot chart or pivot table, you're refreshing all of your pivot charts and pivot tables with that underlying data connection there. And so you won't need to, if you do build out multiple pivot charts, you won't need to go into each pivot chart individually and click refresh. If you click it once with your new data, all of them will get updated directly. Let me see. All right, so let me quickly add in a few of the extra things that I added to this graph here. So I added, in this first example that I showed, I added in a slicer. I will go ahead, I don't know why I decided to say it like that, slicer. But I have a slicer in here. And so I added it for interval channel 1 value. And for this project, this is the behaviors we recorded. That's our first interval channel, substrate was our second. And so I can add that in and have that over here. And basically what a slicer is sort of what it sounds like. You're slicing your data. You're slicing your data by some variables. So right here, you can see these are all the behaviors we have on our project here. Sorry, let me scroll here. And if we wanted to look at, let's say, let me move this over a bit. Substrate is what we have here, but let's say we wanted to look at it by when they're standing, where are they standing? And you can see all of a sudden, it's interesting that Annie, our female, we see in the morning hours, a lot of time we record her as standing, she's on land. But then, and on land or partially submerged. But you can see by the afternoon, every time we're recording her as standing, floating, she's generally in the water, and Pogo is pretty much in the water the whole time. And so that's really easy to do here, with having these slicers over here. Let's say we wanted to look at feeding foraging behavior. Where is that occurring substrate-wise? And so you can see we can just click that, and then it'll automatically filter the chart for that behavior there. So really powerful way to just quickly be able to filter your data you're interested in by other columns in your data. And I can go ahead and clear filter up there. And another one, so certainly I would say if you had any other session questions that are important to you, those would be good to add as slicers up here. So remember, pivot chart, analyze, insert slicer. We don't for this project really have that. So we really just have temperature, which I could add temperature. This is outdoor temperature and these are indoor animals. So it's probably not the most valuable here, but if this was an outdoor space, you can see we could click one of these here too. And you see if we individually click these slicers, it's just selecting one temperature. And so if you want to multi-select here, that's what this button is referring to here. So this is multi-select. If you click that, you'll see it'll stay active. And now let's say if we wanted 50 to 60 degrees, I can select all of those values right there and easily get that. And so this would be the behavior when it was, or the substrate use when it was 50 to 60 degrees outside. So very easily able to do that there. Okay, so I'm going to make a second, I'm going to make this second example here because I think this really demonstrates a little bit better, a good value use for this timeline here. And so to do this, we're going to go back to our data And I have the new data in there. That's fine. I already showed how to add that and refresh. I'm going to pivot chart. And we are going to add in, so this question I really want to look at, are we seeing any sort of trends over time? And so naturally, that's the session start time variable. It's going to be the important one to drag down there. So the session start time is going to be, when that specific session occurred there. And let me see, I'm going to also drag down, we would want to know by focal name. So I'm going to put focal name above that. So I have Annie, have all of Annie's observations there. And then let me pull down our interval channel 2 value, just like we had it before. And here we go. And you can see this graph can't really make much sense out of this. Very small, way too many columns here, because it's doing it as a clustered column. So what we're going to do is we're going to change this again, change this chart type to the 100% stacked column here. Obviously, there's other ones you could do. In fact, let's just show really quick, since we are looking at longitudinal, and your gut reaction would probably be to think, let's do a line graph. And that makes sense, right? And so let's put this line graph in. And this works. We can go to percent of row total. So now we're looking at more of a percents for each day here. Apologies. So let me go ahead and ungroup that. So it was automatically grouping it, which I'll show in a second here. So this is all of our session start times here in this graph. And so what I wanted to show is this timeline. So if you go up to Pivot Chart Analyze, you'll see next to Slicer, there's also Timeline. And so it automatically looks for date time variables in your data set. So it's automatically finding those and only giving you those options there. And so let's do that for start time. And so you could, of course, gone over here and tried to filter these values, but this is a more user-friendly way to do that. So now we have, this timeline up here that we can then filter. And so let's say I wanted to look at just last December. I can go to 2021, December, click that, and just have that data there. And so looking at this, you can see, for instance, here on December 20th, we had 2 sessions. We had one at 10:50 and then another at 2:30 here. And so we might not want, they're going to represent it here as separate points here. We might not want that. And so one of the things you can do over here is you can actually group. And so if you watch the pivot table demo, I actually went in and ungrouped there, because when you add it in, it automatically groups it by quarters, by years, which wasn't what we were looking for there. But in this case, it is actually could be helpful to use the grouping function. So showing kind of where that could be of value, grouping it by day here. And so you see now for December 20th, instead of having 2 sessions there, now there's just one. So each data point here is just going to represent, each point on the line is just going to represent one day, not multiple sessions, which is what we would have had before here. And so you can see this is what our chart looks like here, our line chart. That works totally fine. I do feel like I personally get a little bit more value out of the clustered column chart. And so, especially if you're getting more data in there, so you can see what it would look like there. The important thing here is to keep in mind what your categories are ordered. So this bottom one is obviously going to be, you're going to tell that first visually, perception wise, you're going to see this jump out. Being able to identify relative changes, is this different than this in middle categories? That's really where the stacked column chart like this is a little bit more challenging. But if you're just using this to look at some relative trends and changes over time, I think you can still see those kind of show up here. So if we looked at maybe a couple months here, you'll see, for the time submerged, you'll see that all of a sudden here it grew quite a bit with Pogo, and then kind of varied a little bit for different days. And so an easy way you can quickly look at some of the stuff and just visualize it a little bit differently than the line chart there. Let me think, is there anything else I want to show here? We still have this blank over here. That's going to bother me. So let's get that out of there. I think that's it. I think that's everything I have here for the pivot charts. You can see just being able to click these, if you were doing monthly reports, how easy this would be to just click the new month that you have your data and then have all that data in there. So there's definitely, just to reiterate here, a lot of value in pivot charts, but I really do think that it speaks to that dynamic nature of your data. If your data is changing frequently and you want to quickly update it, I think that's where pivot charts are certainly going to be your friend. If you do have that long-term data set that you're analyzing, your data collection is done, I would just probably rely more on pivot tables and then graphing your data after you've copied and pasted it out of your pivot table, for all the reasons that we just talked through. So I hope this helps. And if you have, any questions about pivot tables or pivot charts, feel free to email me and reach out, and hope to see you in our next demo. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like that video, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel to be notified when we release more videos. If you have any questions about ZooMonitor, you can always feel free to contact us at ZooMonitor@lpzoo.org. Thanks.